Hello, my name is Terry McVenes, and I'm honored to serve as the president and CEO of RTCA. RTCA has a tremendously rich history, having served the aviation community with distinction and effectiveness since 1935, with a focus on standards development, collective decision-making, and consensus building. We are continuing to evolve our organization to meet the needs for new and emerging trends in aviation, empowering innovation through collaboration, and building upon our legacy and our reputation for accomplishment. Now, towards that goal, we're excited to expand our associations with government and industry partners so we can best serve the entire aviation community. Today, I'm pleased to have with me Mr. Robert Poole, the Director of Transportation Policy at the Reason Foundation, which is a public policy think tank based in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. Bob, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Terry. It's good to be with you.
So just to get things started, tell me a little bit more about your background and your work at the Reason Foundation.
Well, I grew up in an aviation family, Eastern Airlines, my dad worked for, so we flew on passes in the days when there was 50% load factors and flying was very expensive. We always dressed up when we flew. And I went to MIT, not sure what, I thought about majoring aero and astro, but finally decided that I wasn't sure I really wanted to be in aerospace my whole career. So I chose mechanical engineering as general engineering. And that turned out to be a wise choice, given that my only aviation job was Sikorsky Aircraft for 2.5 years, and I didn't like aerospace, as big and bureaucratic. So I eventually got into public policy and co-founded Reason Foundation in 1978 and became its first CEO for 20 years, doing a little bit of transportation policy work as CEO. But my board and I decided that the policy work was really good, but Reason needed a full-time CEO doing nothing but raising money and building the organization, and that wasn't me. I decided after 20 years. So it's been a wonderful thing. We have a great CEO. The organization is 3 times the size in the last 20 years, thanks to David's work. And I have done, I think, probably the best public policy work of my career in surface transportation and in aviation policy.
Great. You've obviously done a lot of work with and have done a lot of research and presented a lot of material over your career on different models for the air traffic control systems around the world. And I think one of the challenges with air navigation service providers throughout the world is financial stability. While commercialization certainly does encourage innovation in technology and service delivery, it does have the drawback of putting a little bit of pressure on airspace users to shoulder the cost of that innovation. How do you see that airspace users and air traffic organizations can work effectively together to ensure that innovation is approached responsibly to deliver equitable outcomes?
Yeah, this partly depends on making sure airlines really appreciate the value of ANSPs and their need to be continuing to push the state of the art. And that means that obviously gets into the cost base that they have to pay for. And we're going to have a lot of new entrants as advanced air mobility comes along, and as we have much bigger space launch and recovery with reusable rockets. All these new entrants need to start paying ATC user fees. They should not be getting these services for free, and that's going to help. But I think the biggest thing when you have unexpected major downturns, NAV Canada, of course, has a rate stabilization fund that its customers have accepted, or at least the government says it's all right for them to do it, that puts aside some money every year in a reserve account that is intended to help in a recession to not have to raise charges, to draw on that account to try to tide them over without rating. In some downturns that worked, in others like COVID, it absolutely was not not enough to begin with. So I put out a thought about a year ago, drawing on my experience with hurricanes in Florida and earthquakes in California. Catastrophe bonds is something that started after Hurricane Andrew, where they're non-investment grades, high risk but high yield, and the conditions are that you can call on them in the event of a specified level of disaster.
Mhm.
And I think this is something that ANSPs really ought to be looking into. It could provide the kind of cash flow, emergency cash flow, to get them through these tough periods. There's not that much that an ANSP can cut back. Airports can close one or two terminals if they have multiple terminals, which we saw many airports did. But you can't close down major sectors because there's always some traffic, and you need the people and the technology. So I think that's the direction that we really need to go in for the future.
Great. The air traffic control system is going to be challenged in the not too distant future. In fact, it probably already is, with having to accommodate millions of drones, eVTOL aircraft, urban air mobility vehicles, commercial space, supersonic aircraft. At the same time providing for traditional operators like the military and commercial air transport business and general aviation aircraft. Some say that things like dynamic trajectory separation tools based on RMP and data link are the solution. Do you see it the same way, or is there something else out there?
I think we are still in the R&D phase on how we're going to cope, and there's models cropping up, certainly for AAM in Europe, and different models in different countries, and divisions about who should be, whether the ANSP should be responsible down to altitude 0, or whether some other organization or organizations should have charge of different lower altitude airspaces. But it's clear to me that, I think the whole advanced air mobility community recognizes that traditional labor-intensive air traffic management cannot possibly handle the volumes in those airspaces. And so we're going to need more automation techniques, probably artificial intelligence applications to deal with that. And once, I've talked to a lot of people on this subject, and they're far-ranging thinkers saying, well, you're not going to change this first at the level of FAA and ANSPs. You're going to change it first of necessity in the very low altitude airspace. And the things that we invent for that are then going to have to migrate gradually into the conventional domain of ANSPs. And what that is going to be, I really don't know, Terry. I don't think any of us really do. And RMP for a 50-pound drone, I don't think is going to be the answer. We're going to need some other kinds of automation to deal with the volume of numbers and the cost of that would impose on very small, lightweight vehicles.
Yeah. One of the areas that gets a lot of talk these days is aviation's impact with the environment. I think it's in November you wrote a really thoughtful piece about the challenges aviation and climate policy makers are facing, and sometimes making pledges that are unlikely to be achievable. Yes. So what's going to happen if technology is unable to meet the goals or those targets that some of these policymakers are coming up with?
That's the challenge facing all sectors of the economy, but aviation in particular, because it looks to be very, very hard for aviation to get to zero without crippling reductions in size and scope. And I think the cost of that to the world economy is just too awful to bear. So I think the first lesson is that aviation needs to start talking to and listening to economists, because economists have a different view. The standard view is that every sector must get down to zero, no matter what it costs. And that is a recipe for making economies poor. It's obviously important to do as much as we can on global warming, but what economists suggest is we look at each sector and the various kinds of measures that could be taken to reduce the carbon footprint. And you can calculate the cost per 1,000 tons and look for first the low-hanging fruit. The stuff you can do for $10 a 1,000 tons, well, that we're going to do with all deliberate speed. The stuff when you get to $100 a ton, well, okay, yes, probably a lot of that makes sense and should be done. When you're looking at $1,000 a ton, all of a sudden you've got to say, now wait a minute, let's look at the benefits, what the losses of what we would have in terms of higher cost and reduce service and so forth if we actually went that way. And what this boils down to, when you get to a lot of those very high-end cost per ton things, it really starts making the case for reducing CO2, in other words, what's called negative emissions. Large-scale agricultural techniques that reduce the emissions from farming, large-scale enhancement of the forest tree cover of the globe, that takes a while for forests to grow, but if we start in the next 10 years, by 2030, by 2200, God, I mean by the next end of the century, we will have a much bigger tree cover that and big studies have shown large-scale impacts on the Earth's CO2 output for all these large amounts of trees sucking things up. And carbon capture and sequestration is still it's still very costly, but more R&D on that really makes sense to see if we can come up with ways that can do that at a realistic cost per ton reduced. So that's the general picture, and that's what it's a summary of the article I wrote, I think. But aviation is not in that conversation. Bill Gates wrote a whole book that includes this point of view. McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group have done studies. Magazines like The Economist have written long pieces about the need for this kind of approach. Aviation needs to get in that conversation, and it's not. It's simply buying the standard view, which is not going to do the job.
So just to conclude, just basically a short answer. If you could sum up 2 or 3 of the top challenges that you see facing aviation industry today, what would they be?
Well, I think the top one is what we just talked about is climate change, and aviation risks being severely cut back in size and scope if we don't have a change of thinking about how to do this. I think the new modes that we talked about is probably second, because that is a huge challenge to the kind of air traffic control that we've known throughout the age since aviation first began. Very labor-based, with gradual technical aids, but with still the human in the loop being the key player. And I guess the third is various aspects of funding and financing that, again, we sort of talk. We really have talked about, I think, what are probably the 3 biggest challenges facing aviation and air traffic control as we go forward. It's going to be an exciting time. I'm not retiring anytime soon, but.
Well, Bob, thank you. This has been great. Appreciate you being here. Thanks for sharing your views with me and with our audience today. It's always interesting and fascinating to hear a variety of views on subjects that are so important to our industry. So thank you.
Thanks again, Terry, for having me.
So I've been speaking today with Mr. Robert Poole, the Director of Transportation Policy at the Reason Foundation. If you are interested in learning more about our standards development work, have any questions about the training that we provide, or are interested in just becoming a part of the RTCA family of members so that you too can have a voice in developing aviation standards, you can contact us directly through our website at www.rtca.org. Thank you for listening and have a great day.